On the 7th of February, at the royal palace in the village of Sutton Courtenay in the green Berkshire countryside, a baby girl was born. Her mother had likely lost her first child only a year before, but this time she brought into the world a healthy child, whose fate no one could have guessed at this point. This child was Matilda, daughter to King Henry I of England and his wife, Edith Matilda of Scotland. Her mother had originally been named Edith, but now bore a name preferred by the Normans, Matilda. She was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, a member of the West Saxon royal family, and a descendant of Alfred the Great. Although her family tree had been pushed from the throne of England by the ruling Norman dynasty, her regal credentials were not in question. By contrast, Henry I was one of the sons of William the Conqueror, an illegitimate count who had taken the English throne by force, Henry himself snatching the crown from his younger brother after his elder brother's death. He had wealth and power, but not much in the way of royal bloodlines. And so their marriage had a dual purpose: legitimacy for Henry and his heirs, and a return to high status and power for Edith Matilda of Scotland. This was the world Matilda was born into, one of power, status, and her father's iron grip on the kingdoms of England and Normandy. But Matilda was not an only child. Just a year later, her mother gave birth to a son, William Adelin, a Normanized version of William the Ethelin. As a male child, he was now the heir to Henry's crown. His upbringing would be a reflection of his later projected role to the royal dynasty. We know very little about his life until his early death, but William of Malmesbury, a chronicler of the time, tells us that he was educated and destined to the succession. It is likely that he would have learned Latin and French amongst other texts, especially as his mother was very well educated herself. He would also have learned military skills and political skills, partly which he gained when he became Duke of Normandy when still a teenager. This was mostly due to his father balking at the idea of paying homage to the French King Louis VI, as he was a king himself. To get around this, he put the Dukedom of Normandy on his son's shoulders and sent him along to pay homage instead. But Henry I was a shrewd political leader, and we have to assume he would not have given Normandy to William Adelin unless he thought he was capable of controlling the duchy. Matilda, by contrast, would have been prepared for a very different future. Even though she was a girl, it's also likely that she was well educated. Her own mother was, so there would be no reason for her not to be the same. Although she was merely going to be the wife of some foreign prince, being able to speak other languages would give her an advantage, and knowing a little of politics would have enabled her to support her future husband. She would almost certainly have been raised and educated in religious morals. Her mother, Edith Matilda, had been raised in her aunt's nunnery, and was deeply pious in the later years of her life. We have no evidence of where Matilda was brought up, but it's possible she lived with her mother and her mother's household at Westminster. We don't even know what she looked like. While chroniclers of the time gave descriptions of many members of her family, including her mother and father, they are disappointingly vague about Matilda, saying only that she was very beautiful. But that doesn't help much, as it was convention of the time to say this about most noble and royal daughters. Perhaps it is telling that Matilda's story is dominated not by her appearance, but by her acts and forceful personality in adult life. While she would also have been raised from a young age to understand her role as a future queen consort, this wasn't to say that women of the period could expect to sit in a castle and do nothing but weave tapestries. Noble women of the time were often active patrons of the arts and churches. Many noble women held their own property and lands and would know how to run an estate. However, Many women controlled lands or estates only through their husband, as a proxy of their husband's power. But through this temporary transfer of power, women were able to command armies, demand tribute, and defend their lands. It's not hard to see how, if a woman had the knowledge to do these things and was given a chance to exercise that power in her own right, she would want to take it. From 1108, across the Channel in Europe, Heinrich, or Henry V, the German king, was seeking an official marriage with a young, eligible princess. And Matilda was a great catch for the royal marriage market. Young and well-educated, she had the blood of two royal dynasties in her veins. But the main attraction for Heinrich would have been her father's wealth sourced from the rich estates of England and Normandy. In order to be crowned as Holy Roman Emperor, Heinrich needed to march to Rome and settle the investiture controversy. This was a conflict between the papacy and the royals over who should be allowed to choose and install bishops, something which was causing problems within Heinrich's empire. The dowry for taking Matilda's hand in marriage was 10,000 silver marks, which would equate to around over £116 million in today's money. It was an easy solution for everyone. Heinrich would gain a new bride, who through her dowry would be able to fund his expedition to Rome and in the future would give him an heir, and Henry I got increased legitimacy for his reign, now that his young daughter would become the German Queen and Holy Roman Empress. A deal was struck, and at Easter 1110, young Matilda set out for Utrecht at just 8 years old. She was engaged by proxy, and her actual marriage would not happen until she was a few years older, but her life was now to be in Germany. It would be the last time she was on English soil again for 15 years. Travelling with a retinue of clergy and nobles, she was received in Liège to great pomp and ceremony, where she met for the first time the man she was to marry, Heinrich V, who was 16 years her senior. It's hard to know how Matilda might have felt. As a princess, she would have known from a young age what her role in life would be, and she was doing something that was commonplace amongst princesses and young noblewomen. Nevertheless, she was in a foreign land, without her parents, distant from the home and language she knew so well. It's not difficult to imagine that it might have been a little intimidating, or that she was possibly unimpressed by how old her new husband must have seemed to her. But she was warmly received, as much probably for her dowry as for the fact she was so young. While in Liège, Matilda did her first act in her capacity as queen, even before she was crowned. She was asked at Liège to plead on behalf of a disgraced nobleman, Godfrey, Count of Louvain and Duke of Lower Lorraine. Her actions helped ensure he was restored to his former lands and titles, returning his family to good fortunes. This would be significant in her later life, after his daughter Adeliza became Henry I's second wife, and therefore Matilda's stepmother, and also as her first taste of regal power. Heinrich and Matilda set off together, and soon arrived in Utrecht, where they were formally betrothed once again. Heinrich lavished his new bride-to-be lands and titles befitting her status. Riding through German lands, Cologne, Speyer and Worms, the couple arrived at Mainz Cathedral to celebrate Matilda's coronation as queen. While she was too young to be married, the medieval church viewed a betrothal as legally binding, and she could be crowned in lieu of her future vows. On the 25th of July, 1110, Matilda was crowned as Queen of Germany in Mainz by the Archbishop of Cologne. Everything about the ceremony was designed to impose and leave the audience at the coronation awestruck, including the young princess. The cathedral at Mainz was a mere 100 years old, and its sandstone walls were covered in dazzling white plaster inside and out, with only the red and yellow painted cornices left outside. A grand octagonal dome and tower rose from it that had been built by her late father-in-law, Heinrich IV. She was anointed and crowned by the Archbishop of Cologne with all ceremony, and there's no doubt the whole coronation would have left Matilda with a sense of regal responsibility for her new imperial role. But after Matilda's coronation, her path diverged from that of her future husband. She left for Trier, where she was to live and study for the next 4 years, learning the language and customs of her new country. Heinrich V instead turned his attentions to Rome, spending lavish amounts of the riches his young queen had brought with her dowry. Orderic Vitalis suggested around 30,000 troops were used to form his army, an imposing show of power as he rode over the Alps towards the Italian provinces. He headed for Pope Pascal II, taking him captive and, according to William of Malmesbury, kept him and some of his fellow bishops in confinement for 3 weeks. This imposed capture worked, as the Pope agreed to grant the king the right to choose bishops, and Heinrich promised to return all the possessions and positions he had removed from the church. On the 13th of April, 1111, he was finally coronated with the imperial crown. Heinrich V was now Holy Roman Emperor. But just a year later, the Pope and his bishops withdrew many of their promises, stating that those oaths obtained under the duress of being captive made them invalid. This left Matilda uncrowned as Empress, at least for now. However, Matilda was still Queen of Germany, and she could still become the Emperor's wife. Just before her 12th birthday, on the 7th of January 1114, in the splendid magnificence of Worms Cathedral, she was wedded to Heinrich V in a grand ceremony, attended by a huge number of noble onlookers and clergy. They brought with them an enormous outpouring of gifts for the royal couple, and for his part, Heinrich gave away rich gifts for the entertainment of the wedding, the minstrels and jesters mentioned by an anonymous chronicler who was present. The same guest stated that Matilda was distinguished and beautiful, and held to bring glory and honour to both the Roman Empire and the English realm. Her behaviour and the manner with which she carried herself obviously impressed at least some of the onlookers. This was also the beginning of Matilda's public life. She put aside her school books at Trier, now educated in the ways of the imperial empire to a degree that she would be expected to understand how to help rule the lands of her husband. If he was not present in person due to war or rebellion in his domain, Matilda would now be expected to wield his power through her person. Her own mother, Edith Matilda, had provided a strong example of this when she watched over England during Henry I's long visits to Normandy. And in his presence, Matilda could be an influence for Heinrich to show clemency by virtue of being a feminine voice in his ear, allowing him to be merciful without appearing weak, as when she had interceded for Godfrey, Count of Louvain. Matilda was loved by the imperial nobles, and the poor saw her as a pious mother figure. She fulfilled her duties so well that her German subjects admiringly called her the Good Matilda, or the Good Maud. This was a very different version of Matilda to the way she was later portrayed in England. In 1116, Heinrich moved swiftly to fill the void left by Matilda of Tuscany when she died, a powerful noblewoman who had held vast estates in northern Italy. His own father had repeatedly come into conflict with Matilda, a legend amongst her people for leading an army against him, with herself at the head brandishing a sword. His son had wisely decided not to make the same mistake, instead coming to terms with the Countess and making peace with her. As a result of his careful and respectful relationship with her, including making her his lieutenant in Liguria and Imperial Vicar and Vice Queen of Italy, according to her biographer Donizio, when she died, she named Heinrich as her heir. Rather than waiting for the Pope to take the lands he had been promised by the Countess, the German king took the opportunity to take them for himself, to increase his imperial control over Italy. In February, Heinrich set off across the Alps once more at the head of his army, this time with Matilda at his side. They completed a 300-mile journey as they pushed over the snow-capped mountains towards Italy, passing through Venice and Padua before arriving at the hill fortress of Canossa, Matilda of Tuscany's castle. While the Countess had been a strong and capable leader, her rule had also been harsh and tightly controlled. Recognizing this, when Heinrich V rode through the gates of Canossa Castle, he promised those who had been her vassals generous compromises. It worked, and the royal couple were eagerly welcomed into the northern Italian lands. Matilda herself was warmly welcomed as a fitting replacement for Matilda of Tuscany. Now they had only to look to Rome, but Pope Pascal, unwilling to be met once again by Heinrich and his army, had already fled with his papal curia 80 miles away to the Abbey of Monte Cassino. The royal party once more set off, this time to take the city of Rome, and in 1117 they succeeded. However, with no pope to crown his wife, Heinrich took matters into his own hands and installed the anti-pope Gregory VII, otherwise known as Mauritius Boudin, an archbishop of Brega who saw more power in being at the emperor's side than the pope's. Just before Easter of that year, passing over the river Tiber in boats in order to reach St. Peter's Basilica, as the way across the bridge was blocked by supporters of Pope Pascal II, a royal procession made its way inside the Grand Church of the Pope. Finally, Matilda was crowned as Empress of the Romans. But there were holes to be picked in the ceremony. The crown she now wore had not been placed on her head by the elected Pope, and she therefore was not anointed Empress. This was a symbolic crown wearing, not a coronation. However, the ceremony was still within the Pope's church, in the city that was the centre of Christianity for medieval Western Europe, by the side of the anointed Holy Roman Emperor, her husband. For the rest of her life, Matilda would now carry the title Matilda Imperatrix, Empress Matilda. There is no doubt that Matilda was not idly standing by and weaving with her ladies-in-waiting while all this had happened. Through her husband's capable actions, she had witnessed how careful planning could lead to increased lands and power, and how a crown could be taken instead of given. She had witnessed the visceral game of politics that ensnared medieval Europe, dealing with their spiritual souls as well as their bodies. A crown had been placed on her head as a symbol of sharing in her husband's divine power. Her chance to wield that power for herself came in 1118, when Heinrich had to return to the north to deal with a rebellion of the imperial princes in Germany. She remained as deputy ruler in Italy, still only 16 years old, under the protection of Heinrich's army. The task she now had was different to being the merciful, dutiful consort. Now, she had to embody the emperor's power and rule. There are few accounts of how she took on this task, but there are some examples of how she presided over courts with the support of Filippo, Bishop of Ravenna. On the 11th of September, 1117 at Rocca Carpineto, she found in favour of the provost of the church at Reggio Emilia. Another account shows on the 14th of November 1118 how she sat over a court at Castrocaro, in the fertile valleys and hills of Emilia-Romagna, when a bishop and the convent of Santa Maria from the neighbouring towns of Forli and Faenza respectively had conflicting claims over a local church. The youthful queen declared in favour of the convent, adding an imperial prohibition on anyone who dared to challenge her ruling. It would seem she was not afraid to remind her subjects that while she was the good Matilda, she was also capable of being a powerful and effective ruler in her husband's stead. On the 1st of May 1118, her mother passed away without her children by her side, her son away in Normandy, her daughter ruling in Italy. It would have taken several weeks for the sad news to reach Matilda, and it's difficult to imagine how hard the news must have been. She hadn't seen her mother now for 8 years, half of her life. While it must have been devastating news, as news of a parent's death would be, it must have also felt very detached. But sadly, this wasn't the only news of death that Matilda would receive, and the second death was to dramatically alter the course of events. In 1120, her brother William Adelin, heir to the English throne, died. William and his father were returning from Normandy, and while his father went ahead in a different ship, William Adelin and his many companions decided to go later on a second ship, the White Ship. The White Ship, La Blanche Nef, was the swiftest and best-made ship in the royal fleet. As with most young men who have power and wealth, William was probably a magnet for the other young nobles of the court, including many of his half-siblings. They took to having plenty of wine, steadily getting more drunk until they at last set sail across the channel. It was a bad decision. It was dark and likely cold and rough on the channel, as it was winter. The revellers on board urged the captain to speed up the ship to pass the king's own vessel. He did their bidding, only for the ship to steer onto a rock, capsizing when the crew failed to push themselves off with oars. The only survivor of the wreck, a butcher from Rouen, told how William Adelin might have survived, as he managed to get himself to a boat. But upon hearing the cries of Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, one of his illegitimate half-siblings, he turned back to save her. Many others jumped into his boat, overfilling it. All sank into the channel and drowned. It must have been terrifying to be in the dark, cold waters between England and France, at a time when the chance of being saved, or even of your body being found, were incredibly slim. This was a devastating disaster, similar to the sinking of the Titanic. Many young nobles of the Norman court were lost to the sea, and most of all, the loss of William Adelin was deeply felt by his father, Henry I. Not only had he lost his son, but also his heir and the stability of his dynastic line. When the news reached Matilda, it must have been another regretful but strangely distant piece of unfortunate news. When she had last seen her brother, he had been 6 years old. They had grown up apart, and while again she must have felt the loss of a brother, it's likely it was less difficult for herself than her father to find peace with it. Within a matter of weeks, Henry I had remarried, his mind already on the matter of creating another male heir. Godfrey, Count of Louvain, the man whom his own daughter had defended on behalf of her husband's clemency so many years before, approached the king and offered his eldest daughter's hand in marriage, Adeliza of Louvain. She was young, chroniclers described her as very beautiful, and she was descended through her mother from Charlemagne. There is little information on the relationship she had with her stepdaughter Matilda, but it's likely they got on well with each other. They were a similar age, they were both somewhat foreign to the Norman court, even if Matilda had been born in England, and events later in Matilda's life would suggest there was a mutual bond between them. 35 years her senior, the aging King Henry I kept his young wife Adeliza close, travelling extensively with her, probably to increase the chances of conception. Despite having many children with other women over the course of his reign, Henry needed an heir who was legitimate. However, for all his previous children, and the fact that Adeliza would go on to have 7 children with her second husband, no royal heir was ever conceived. But there was one more event that would dramatically change the path of Matilda's life. In 1125, at 38 years old, her husband Heinrich V died from cancer, leaving her, as she had not given birth to his heir, no longer a German queen. The loss must have been devastating. Since she had left England as an 8-year-old child, Heinrich V had been the central pillar to her future, her new family and life. Orderic Vitalis stated that the emperor had cared deeply for Matilda. He had trusted her to the point where she had ruled in his absence on his behalf. They had travelled together on his expeditions to quell or grow his empire. Although we can only speculate on their relationship, it would seem Matilda was a trusted and much-loved companion of Heinrich, by whose rule she had gained valuable experience in the politics, powers and dangers of commanding an empire. Experience that she would no doubt later draw on during the next chapter of her life. Matilda had no further part to play in Western Europe's greatest imperial empire. Although her marriage had been a personal success, it was a failure in terms of dynastic ambition, as Heinrich and Matilda had no children. Had she given birth to a son, it was possible she could have ruled as regent on his behalf until he came of age. But when Heinrich's body was brought alongside the Rhine to be laid amongst his kinsmen at Speyer Cathedral, he was the last Salian king and emperor. He left in Matilda's care the symbols of his imperial status, his crown, lance, and sword. Once her husband's earthly remains had been laid to rest, she handed these over to the Archbishop of Mainz, who was to preside over an election of the next king of Germany. Matilda was now a 23-year-old widow, but, due to her status and father, she was still a glittering prize for marriage. Some of the German princes asked for her hand in marriage, but these were turned down, as Matilda instead made her way back to Normandy at her father's request. She had spent more than 2/3 of her life at the side of her German husband, but now she had to return to England and her father, a foreigner in the land she had been born in. She would have spoken Norman French with a German accent, and her courtly manners would be German, very different from the small French-speaking girl who had left so long ago. But she was likely also confident and self-assured, certain of her own mind and of her own political and regal skills. She continued to style herself Empress Matilda. The Empress also brought wealth home with her, in the form of 2 jewelled crowns of solid gold, one of them so heavy that it could only be worn when supported by 2 silver rods, and the mummified hand of the Apostle St. James, on whose feast day she had been crowned at Mainz Cathedral. The crowns included the one she had worn, a heavy golden effort, covered with golden flowers. There is little sympathy to be found from the Anglo-Norman chroniclers who described the newly returned Matilda as haughty and somewhat full of herself. There's no mention of what it must have been like to be a stranger in an unfamiliar land, a widow to a man who, by all accounts, had loved his wife and treated her well, whom she had spent most of her life with. It's also strange that there seems to be no consideration that this was a woman who had every right to appear regal and perhaps a little full of grandiose manners, as Matilda had held an imperial title, been crowned in the Pope's own church, and had been the consort of the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. It also must have been a culture shock, coming back to the Anglo-Norman court to an uncertain future. Except that one monumental decision made by her father was about to decide that future for her.